Morning, everyone.
You know.
We're going to get started.
But I got to go to a new
welcome
membership for a few
I
minutes.
guess the Sunday where we have one less hour of sleep. Unless you're disciplined to go to bed early, which I'm typically not. Well, we're going to begin by, I'm just going to ask a question, which I think has probably been an important question, even though people have typically not asked it in popular or traditional readings of the book of Revelation. And the question, let me just frame it this way and say that for most people for whom the book of Revelation is a futuristic prediction, one of the things that becomes, I think, problematic for that kind of reading very quickly is to ask the question, well, what relevance beyond giving us maybe some information to satisfy curiosity, what's the relevance and what kind of picture of the Christian church in its sort of calling and in its activity does that kind of reading of Revelation actually present? Now, I've kind of framed it, let me ask the question more specifically. Is there any incentive in the book of Revelation to actually do mission or faithfully witness to the work of the Lamb if this is all futuristic prediction and the church, by those kinds of readings, is not even around for all of this stuff? So many popular readings of Revelation actually assume that at the very most, the first 3 chapters are relevant to the church. Everything else kind of deals with material or events that happen long after the church is, in one form or another, gone. And I guess the question then is, what's the point? Does the author actually assume that there's any work that Christians should do? Because if you read Revelation that way, it's very possible to come away thinking God's going to judge who He's going to judge, things are going to happen the way they're going to happen, and this is maybe where we get some of the old hymns and choruses that talk about holding fast or staying strong or holding the fort. We just kind of batten down the hatches and wait for the end to come, and then it all just kind of happens. I'm going to suggest to you that the book of Revelation, every chapter, every vision, every sequence of events was significant for the daily lives of the people that this book was first, or these visions were first intended toward. And the answer to the question, what does the author believe about Christian mission, I think is answered in chapters 10 and 11. So that's what we're going to look at today. So you have the handout in front of you, Christian Communities and Faithful Witness, and we'll just open with prayer and get into it, all right? Father, thanks so much for the chance to gather again on this 8th class session for us on the book of Revelation. Thank you for the things that we've already seen, the revelation of the great cosmic drama in chapter 12, which depicts this insignificant male child born in Bethlehem ultimately becoming ruler of all the kingdoms of the world. And then when we ask questions about how does that happen, we discover that it doesn't happen the way people typically take power, but it happens through suffering and sacrifice and self-giving. And ultimately, in an event, a death, a crucifixion that looks cosmically like a slaughter of a lamb. And then you remind us, as we look through chapters 6 and 7 and 8, that this event, this life, death, and resurrection of Jesus kind of exposes all of the evil and the chaos and the selfishness and the greed and the anxiety in the world around us. So now we ask the question, what would you have us do by your Spirit in this world? What does it mean for us to be faithful? And help us to begin to explore that question faithfully as we look at the text this morning. Amen. Sometimes prayers just go longer than other times. Sorry about that. I ended up reviewing the class in the context of the prayer. So. All right. I want to make an observation. We're looking at chapters 10 and 11 in Revelation. And again, for those of you, if you're jumping in first time or you've missed a couple of Sundays along the way, we started in chapter 12 and asked, how does apocalyptic literature function? And I suggested to you that chapter 12 is actually a birth narrative. So we typically think of Matthew and Luke as telling us about the birth of the Messiah. I think Revelation 12 is a birth narrative, but it's an apocalyptic retelling of that. And then we went to chapter 1 and to chapter 4 and 5, and then we looked at chapters 2 and 3, the messages to the churches, and made some observations about the real lives of real people. And then we went to chapters 6 and 7 and talked about how Jesus, in his life, death, resurrection, the message, what he proclaims, exposes the pretense and the power of this world. And now we're going to ask the question, so what is the role, what does it look like to faithfully follow the Lamb? And in chapters 10 and 11, we have 3 sequences. And you'll see on your notes there's a couple of blanks here. So we have 3 successive visions. And here's the words that I will give you to kind of describe. It is one-word descriptions of each of these visions. There's a vision of a seer, S-E-E-R. That's someone who sees things, or a visionary. So the seer. The second one is the temple. And the third one is the witnesses. So there are 2 witnesses. So we have the vision of a seer, the vision of the temple, and then the vision of the 2 witnesses. And all of these relate to, and here's the second blank on your outline, all 3 of these visions, in my view, relate to the calling and the mission of the people of God. All right? And where I'm going to get to eventually is to suggest to you that the story of the 2 witnesses is not, and popular readings have suggested that the story of the 2 witnesses is actually a prediction of a literal return of someone like Elijah or Moses. And I'm going to suggest to you that it's a parable of what faithful Christian witness looks like. So, and we'll kind of explore that and have a look at it. But to begin, what I want to do is say that the book of Revelation does not hope that Christians will ignore the world, batten down the hatches, and simply get on with their business faithfully and just let God sort it all out in the end. Rather, I think chapters 10 and 11 suggest that God calls his people to engage the world, to say things about what's happening in the world, and to both experience the joy and the sorrow of being faithful witnesses. And you're going to see that in a few different ways. 2 examples that you can anticipate now. We're going to hear the language of sweet and bitter. We're going to hear the language of death and resurrection. And those are both ways of talking about the joy and the pain that God's people inevitably feel and face when we faithfully follow the Lamb in a broken world. So, the first point then, as kind of preparation for these 2 chapters in Revelation, is to suggest that biblical traditions, places from the old, what we call the Old Testament, have influenced how the author chooses to tell this story of Christian mission. The first comes from the prophetic commissioning of, and blank on your outline here, Ezekiel. All right? So the first blank there under 5.1, or maybe for you it's just point 1, is Ezekiel. And this includes Ezekiel chapters 2 and 3. And I'm not even sure what the second blank was for, so let's just not worry about it. The second example of the use of Ezekiel is the measuring of the temple. So at the start of chapter 11, there's going to be this language of measuring the temple. And on your notes, that comes from Ezekiel 40 to 42. All right? So the book of Ezekiel, in several places, is very important to these 2 chapters in Revelation. The second thing that I want to suggest to you is that Daniel's time, right, that's the first blank, Daniel's use of time and his heavenly figure are also important pieces of Old Testament tradition that the author uses. So how Daniel talks about time, right, and how Daniel speaks about God's action coming in the form of a heavenly figure, those are all important images as well. And then there are also some symbolic actions. So the lampstands and the olive trees that get mentioned come from Zechariah 4. And then, this is very interesting. Very few people recognize this. But I think that God's messengers, Yahweh's messengers to Sodom. Remember the 2 angelic figures that come to Sodom, Genesis 19? I think that that also lies behind the way in which this author tells the story of how Christians can prophetically engage the world. So Ezekiel, Daniel, the book of Genesis, Zechariah, and there are more examples, but those are some of the main. Again, we talked about apocalyptic writers taking images and bits and pieces from a lot of different places and creating something new, repurposing and recycling these images, and that's what's happening here. So let's talk first of all about the prophetic call to Christian witness. This is chapter 10. And one of the things that, I just have a picture here of an artist's depiction of what the Colossus of Rhodes may have looked like. So if you're familiar at all with the Mediterranean area, you'll know that Rhodes is an island off the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey. And there was a time, and it was actually not a very long period of time, because this Colossus, this great statue in which one leg straddled one side of the harbor and the other leg straddled the other side. And some people suggest this Colossus was something in the order of 120 to 180 feet high. But it didn't stand for very long. It was up for less than 6 or 7 decades. So just over 50 years, something like that. But it loomed large in the imagination of people in the ancient world. And people in Asia Minor would have been very familiar with this figure. And from the mainland, it looked to people as though there was a mighty figure with a foot on the land and a foot in the sea. We've already talked about the emperor speaking as one who was lord of the land and the sea. And this is a further image from that part of the ancient world where people would have understood mighty figures, even angelic figures, with a foot on the land and a foot on the sea. And this is just a way of talking about being able to exercise control over all of creation. So if we open up then chapter 10, we're going to hear this kind of language. And so the blank on your outline, there are similarities here to the Colossus of Rhodes, and it also recalls the language of, and here's the blank on your outline, imperial propaganda. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago I had the inscription up, a picture of an inscription where the emperor presents himself as lord of the land and the sea? And so this is all factoring into this. So what I'm going to do is ask if someone, if you have your Bible handy and you're open to chapter 10, could I have someone just read the first couple of verses for us from Revelation 10?
Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven. He was robed in a cloud with a rainbow above his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs were like fiery pillars. He was holding a little scroll, which lay open in his hand. He planted his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and he gave a loud shout like the roar of a lion.
So there are so many different descriptions and images colliding here. Some of you, if you're a careful reader of Revelation, you'll know that there was a rainbow in chapter 4 that described God's presence in the heavenly court. When we see this mighty figure coming in a cloud, it reminds us both of Sinai, when Yahweh came to Israel on a cloud, or shrouded in cloud, but it also reminds us of Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man comes representing the Ancient of Days. So this figure, or this Messiah or saving figure, also comes on a cloud. So this idea of riding on the clouds is not intended to speak of these literal, clouds as literal vehicles, but clouds depict where the gods are, or where they come from. And because Yahweh was shrouded in cloud, and because the gods in the ancient world were thought to live in the heavens, clouds become a ready image that the author can use to say, here's how God's messenger, here's how this great angel, this messenger, arrives. All right? Symbolically, and here, just to follow on then, symbolically, this is an important contrast. This figure contrasts with the imperial figures that brought announcements or good news or spoke of their authority. So this angel is bringing a commissioning, And what it reminds us of is what happened with Ezekiel. All right, so having heard the first couple of verses of chapter 10 read, I now want to compare what happens a little later on in Revelation with Ezekiel chapter 2. So Ezekiel is told, hear what I say to you, do not be rebellious like that rebellious house, reference to Israel. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. I looked, and a hand was stretched out to me, and a written scroll was in it. By the way, let me just continue. He spread it out before me. It had writing on the front and on the back. And what's interesting about this, and I highlighted it in blue on the screen, because this idea of something having been written on the front and the back is exactly how the scroll with the 7 seals was described in chapter 5. It had writing on the inside and on the outside. But remember, the author was weeping at that point because no one was worthy to open that scroll. But here you have Ezekiel also being given a scroll. It has writing on the front and on the back. And written on it were words of lamentation and mourning and woe. And then chapter 3 in Ezekiel, he said to me, O mortal, or O human being, eat what is offered to you, eat this scroll, and go and speak to the house of Israel. So I highlighted this line, to speak to the house of Israel, and you can compare it on the other side with verse 11 in Revelation 10, where it says, you must prophesy again about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. So I think I'm showing you the similarities. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you what you think the differences are between the two. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. He said to me, mortal, eat this scroll that I give you, and fill your stomach with it. Then I ate it. And in my mouth, it was as sweet as honey. And then a little later on in verse 14, then the Spirit lifted me up and bore me away. I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, the hand of the Lord being strong upon me. So now look at Revelation 10. The voice that I had heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, go take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land. So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll. He said to me, take it and eat. It will be bitter to your stomach, but sweet as honey in your mouth. So I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my stomach. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And then that final commissioning to prophesy. So here's my question for you. As you look at these two passages, I think it's obvious to see that how John describes his own calling and commissioning as a prophet is using language that he's already familiar with from Ezekiel's experience in Ezekiel 2 and 3. But there are also important differences. And this is so crucial to reading Revelation. The author doesn't just reproduce the Old Testament, he's using it creatively, and he's often putting a twist on what he finds in these biblical traditions. So I want to hear from you, as you see these two texts in front of you, what do you see as being different between the two? The similarities, I think, seem pretty obvious. Anyone?
Standing on the sea and the land in Revelation.
Okay. So that doesn't seem to appear in Ezekiel? Yeah? Yeah, the angelic messenger, by the way, the messengers that Ezekiel encounters, they come in chariots of fire and all of these kinds of things, right? Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
In Ezekiel, it says only speak to the house of Israel, but in Revelation it says to speak to many people, the nations.
Yeah, very good. That's a really important distinction. So Ezekiel's commissioning is to the people of Israel, and the author of Revelation's commission has become entirely global or universal. It includes all peoples, all languages. And by the way, that breakdown, peoples, nations, languages, and kings, that happens, so the entire story of Earth's peoples is told in 4 categories, and that formula happens 7 times in the book of Revelation. And that's not an accident. The author is working with numbers, and again, the numbers aren't literal so much as they carry a message. So I don't think it's an accident that the author speaks universally and says 4, which is the number of the earth. Remember, 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds of the earth. 4 categories of humans, 7 times scattered throughout the book of Revelation. That is the fullest way he can depict that this message is for all people at all times. All right? Okay, what else is different? So Israel versus all people. Anyone else? Let me just point us in a particular direction. What's the tone of Ezekiel's commissioning? Is this a happy job description? Yes.
How it made his stomach bitter in
Okay.
Revelations, but in Ezekiel, he went away in bitterness.
Okay. All right. So there's a bit of a difference there. Yep. Yeah. And why would he go away in bitterness? You want to just follow that up? And that relates to the tone of the passage.
It seems he became bitter after he ate the scroll, and the Spirit lifted him and bore him away, took him away.
Okay.
And so I'm thinking that he spiritually, God allowed him to understand spiritually what was in the scroll, per se,
Okay.
and
Alright.
it made him bitter. I don't know.
Okay. Anybody else? What's Ezekiel's bitterness all about? It relates to the whole tone of the passage.
The other thing is, in Ezekiel, it actually says what the words are about.
Okay.
And it says written in the words of lamentation and mourning and woe. It doesn't say
Yes.
anything about that in Revelation.
Okay. Good. Yeah. So that is also a partial response to my question about the tone of the passage. But now let's take your observation about the bitterness in spirit, and let's take Adam's observation about the lamentation, mourning, and woe. And now let's go back to the start of the Ezekiel passage. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. All right, let's put all that stuff together. What's the tone of the Ezekiel passage? Anyone?
Kind of doom and gloom.
It is.
You got a message to his rebellious people. You got to carry it. Doesn't sound very inviting.
Exactly right. Yeah. So it seems like the deal is done, right? What's written in the scroll is bad news in Ezekiel. And this idea of sweetness for Ezekiel may be the experience of receiving the word of the Lord, but when he digests it, it's bitter. And he goes away in bitterness because he's got to bring this word to a rebellious people, and as far as he understands it, this does not turn out well, right? This is a negative prophetic commissioning that he gets. So the question I want to ask then when we look at Revelation 10 is, what's the dialectic, what's the interplay between bitter and sweet? And do we find the same kind of negative tone in Revelation? Any observations or thoughts?
Do you think that he described it as sweet because he felt that it was a blessing upon him from God to be able to deliver a message?
Okay, possible, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I don't know if it's significant, but it seems to me the Revelation passage, he actually reaches out and says, so I took the scroll from the hand of the angel. In the other one, he is given the scroll, isn't it?
Okay,
So there's a willingness, it seems to me.
okay, all right. So John is engaged in this, okay. Anyone else? When you see the negativity, so to speak, of the Ezekiel passage, and then you compare it with what, and I understand I have to be careful here because to some degree I'm asking us to observe what's not there, right? I'm asking us to not so much argue from silence, but at least to say, John knows the whole tradition, right? It's not like he's forgetting bits and pieces, but what he chooses to emphasize is what? The personal experience of the seer. And then the final phrase says, you must prophesy again about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. Now here's one of the things that's fascinating. Most longer standing Bible translations do not translate the preposition in verse 11 that's translated as about here, most translations don't use the word about. They use the word against, right? You must prophesy against many people. And as soon as you translate the preposition that way, that completely runs you in a certain track of how you're going to read chapter 10, right? That kind of determines everything. The details really do matter. And I remember having a seminary professor who said, the most important words in sentences are the prepositions. And we all looked at him like, you're nuts, right? I mean, there are more important concepts than prepositions. But this is one of these examples where the meaning entirely rides on how you translate a preposition. So is he prophesying to, or about, or against, or for these peoples, nations, languages, and kings? Yes?
In Revelations, if you notice, it states, then they said to me, but then in Ezekiel, it says, then he said to me.
Right. Yeah. I don't know what to do with that.
Do you think it's more, well, since it's like Revelation is supposed to be the last days, do you think it's more of a pressing matter for the word to get out, for God's message to get out? That's why it's multiple instead of just how it was in earlier in Ezekiel?
Yeah, I got to be honest with you. I mean, there have been different ways that people have kind of handled that problem, because the whole chapter, there seems to be a singular voice. And then right at the end it says, and then they said. So, on the one hand, if we were going to translate that preposition, you must prophesy for many peoples, could it be that the they are all of the peoples and languages and kings? I'm not sure that that's right, but I actually don't know what to do with that plural term there, except to say that it's possible that now both the angel and the message from God now combine some kind of a plural voice. I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts on that, but yeah.
Back to the preposition
Yeah.
idea. The New American Standard Bible
Yeah.
translates it, you must prophesy again.
Okay.
Once more.
Right. Well, I think it has that here. You must prophesy again about.
Well, the for and against, negative and positive, but the about.
That's right. Yeah. So maybe the word about is one way of a translator not making a decision and just simply kind of inserting a placeholder there. Here's for me, here's the way forward. To understand whether this is a positive or a negative commissioning, in other words, is God angry with the world, and is John being asked to prophesy against humanity in a way that kind of judges them or puts them in their place? Or is John being given a commissioning to bring a message to these peoples, sort of in the form of an invitation or an opportunity? The answer to that question, I think, actually comes logically in what we find in chapter 11. So here we have the description of John's commissioning, but the nature of that commissioning is actually going to be made clear, I think, in chapter 11. So let's move forward and look at the second part of our session together, which is chapter 11, where we have two successive visions. One is a very short one of the measured temple, and the second one is longer, and that's the vision of the two witnesses. All right? So first of all, John is told to measure, and I didn't put this up on the screen, but Ezekiel is also told to measure the temple. All right? And there's this threat in Ezekiel of Gentiles coming against or trampling the temple courts, and this would be a very prominent idea because they knew this would actually have happened. And there would have been, in the exile of Israel and Judah, there would have been these moments where the temple courts actually would have been trampled. So if there's someone who doesn't mind reading the first couple of verses of chapter 11, that would help us. Yeah, go ahead.
The two witnesses, chapter 11. I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and was told, go and measure the temple of God and the altars with its worshipers, but exclude the outer court tiles. They will trample the holy city in 42 months, and I will appoint
it's just the first couple verses there. So, yeah, that's great. Thank you. So this initial vision, John is told to take a reed or a measuring rod and to measure the temple. And he's also told that this temple area is going to be under threat, but that it will ultimately be protected. And there will be a limited or a defined period of time in which this kind of threat takes place. So let me ask you a question, and for those of you who have been here over the last number of weeks, can you think of any other times in the book of Revelation to this point that the temple has been mentioned? Anyone?
Just a quick question, is the temple supposed to represent something, or is it?
That's what we're asking right now. No, that's the question, exactly right. Where else have we encountered the temple to this point in Revelation? Remember, one of the promises in the letters to the 7 churches was that those who were faithful would be made pillars in the temple of my God. Right? That's in chapters 2 and 3. And the concept of temple is actually used in 2 ways in Revelation. On the one hand, God's presence, the place where God rules and reigns from, is referred to as the temple in heaven. On the other hand, temple is also understood by this author to be constructed by the churches or the people of God themselves. And that shouldn't be entirely unfamiliar to us, because other early Christian writers like Paul and others use the image of temple for the people of God, right? For example, when Paul says to the Corinthians, "Don't you know you're the temple of the Holy Spirit?" That "you" is plural, and he's essentially saying, don't you know you all together are the temple of the Holy Spirit? So there's another example of an early Christian writer using the concept of temple for the people of God. But in this particular case, John has just been given the commissioning in chapter 10, and the very next thing he's told to do is to measure the temple. All right? And for people who read the book of Revelation in a literal and futuristically oriented way, they're actually expecting attacks on the Temple Mount or Jerusalem to be physically attacked in some way as a fulfillment of this quote-unquote prophecy. On the other hand, if we've been tracking with John's logic all the way through, God not only dwells in his holy temple, but he promises participation and to be part of the construction of that temple to his people on earth. And that seems to be clear in chapters 2 and 3. So the temple here, I think, represents the people of God, the churches, the Christian communities, and the promise to participate in what God is building in terms of his kingdom. And if that is the case, then what we have here is the promise that God will measure and protect his people even while there is attack. All right? So as this text was read, we were told that for a period of time there would be attack and there would be some trampling. And if we go back to your passage that you just read, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Rachel, yes. What was the time period on that?
Oh, in the Bible?
Yes.
For 42 months?
All right, for 42 months. All right. The very next thing, and in a moment we're going to have the next section read, the story or the parable, I think, of the 2 witnesses. But keep that in mind, 42 months, all right? And now I want to go back to how Daniel told time, right? What time is it, according to Mr. Daniel in the Old Testament? There's a couple of examples here that I want to use. And from Daniel 7:25, there was a beast, the 4th beast actually in Daniel's vision. And we don't need to go through all the details of that. I just want to pick up on his description of time. He says, they'll speak words against the Most High, whereof the holy ones of the Most High, those are the people of God, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. So Daniel's anticipating a time where a Gentile ruler comes and tries to overturn Jewish religious observances and cultural conventions and all the things that they consider to be sacred. And they shall be given into his power for a season or a time, 2 times, and half a time. So if we add those up, not sure what length of time that means, but that adds up to what? Anyone? 1 plus 2 plus 0.5 is what? It's 3.5, right? Okay. Now, in the very next chapter, something very interesting takes place. There's a more defined or a more focused description of that attack on the people of God in their holy place. All right? So this more focused description says, because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled?" So here you have this language of trampling again, which we also encountered in Revelation 11, right? And he answered him, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Right, 2,300. How long a period of time is that? 2,300 evenings and mornings. Any ideas?
7 years.
How about 3.5 years?
No, I was gonna say.
You going to go with 3.5? On what basis are you going to go with 3.5?
It's just a lucky guess.
Yeah, if you do rough math, 2,300 days is what? About 7 years. But that's not what the text says. It says 2,300 what? Evenings and mornings, right? So you actually have to cut this in half to get the number of days, which is what? About 1150, which is approximately what, Larry? You just said it.
He wants the A. Give him the A.
It's about 3.5 years. Yeah. All right. So compare the 1 plus 2 plus a half with the 2,300 evenings and mornings. And the time reference in Revelation 1 and 2 was what? 42 months, which is approximately what? All right. So the right answer in this Sunday school class is not Jesus, but 3.5. Right? So just a little bit more. Why the evenings and the mornings? That's a reference to what? Okay, well, you've got it exactly right, but you've jumped ahead just a little bit. So the evening and the morning is the time of the regular sacrifices. So what this author is concerned about is asking the Holy One, how long is this going to be if some evil person or force or, occupying force comes and, makes us not, doesn't allow us to continue to offer sacrifices. And this time frame is intended to tell you, and by the way, this is the way in Jewish tradition people tell time. The Sabbath begins when? Does anybody know? Sundown on, begins in the evening, right? The evening comes first, and then the morning, and the Sabbath is over 6 o'clock on a Saturday night, right? So you have the evening and the morning. It's just the way that the day is constructed. And so this author is concerned with how many of those offerings are going to be canceled, and the answer he's given is 2,300, which is about 1,150 days. But what's interesting then is that this now helps us to understand why when the author of Genesis 1 and 2 tells us that God creates the world, he sees that it's good, and then as the days are numbered, it says what? Evening, morning, day 1. Evening and morning, day 2. Right.
I always say God worked the graveyard shift.
Okay. Well, what's interesting is that the person telling us that creation account is actually structuring Yahweh's work on the regular rhythm of life in the temple and in Jerusalem, right? And he's actually, I think Genesis 1 is actually telling us that the entire cosmos is Yahweh's temple. And the thing we find in Jerusalem is just the replica. It's like the little foyer version of the grand cosmic temple. And so you have this kind of temple language describing creation. The point of that, however, is simply to say that when the book of Revelation uses time and says things like 42 months, 1,260 days, which is again about what? What's the right answer this morning? 3.5 years. Exactly right. So when you have, and by the way, when the author says 3.5 years, what does he mean? It's not that hard. It's 3.5 years. Yeah. So you have 3.5. You have 42 months. You have 1,260 days. You have 2,300 evenings and mornings. It's all the same thing, right? And the point here is that Daniel told the time, and not just time in general, but Daniel was speaking about how the people of God should think about hostile forces and attack and evil and brokenness and chaos in the world. And what he's telling us that is that if 7 is the number of Yahweh's perfection and complete work, a limited, boundaried understanding of that to say that suffering will not go on forever, attack will not go on forever. God knows, He marks, He understands, and the apocalyptic numeric way of saying that is it'll last for 3.5 years, and any number of permutations of that particular time frame. All right? So let's move on then to say, well, let's review by saying the author showed us John's prophetic commissioning and said, this is what God calls His people to do, to take a message that's both sweet and bitter and bring it to the peoples, the nations, the languages, and the kings of the world. And having been given that commissioning, God's people are to understand that they as His temple are measured, protected, and there's a limited time of hostility and trampling. Right? So the larger message is God is calling His people to engage through the prophet, and He is promising protection and measuring and His awareness. Now, what does the job, so to speak, of the people of God actually look like on the ground? Right? And now we read verses 3 to 13, and we come to the last part of our session this morning. Anybody willing to read those 11 verses or so, beginning with verse 3? Anybody got it open? Someone jump in. Just go ahead and read that for us.
Which chapter? Sorry.
11, 3 to 13.
Revelation.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
It's okay.
I got it.
Okay.
And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes from their mouths and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. They have power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying. And they have power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. Their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts, because these 2 prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies looked on. And at that very hour there was a severe earthquake, and 1/10 of the city collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and their survivors were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven.
Very good. Thanks very much, Kurt. So we have this extended account of 2 witnesses, and again, their work is done over a limited period of time. So on your notes, you'll see that there's the reference there to 1,260 days, but let me fill in a couple of blanks for you first, all right? by paying attention to how John reinterprets Old Testament images for his congregations, we can identify this passage as a parable of mission in which the various symbolic images function to illustrate the role of the Christian community in a hostile world. All right, so my suggestion is going to be, given that John has been given this sweet and bitter scroll and told to take the message to the peoples of the world, and in the context of the temple being promised to be measured, protected, boundaried, and all of that for a limited period of time, now these two witnesses take God's message out into the world. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is an example for the author of what the work of Christian communities looks like. And he's not, I don't think, intending us to think that somehow these figures will actually appear and literally do sort of breathe fire and call things down. What he's asking us to do is to think about Christian mission in these biblical terms and these biblical images. All right? So these two witnesses, they work for 1,260 days. And again, this is intended to tell us that both the hard part of their work and the suffering that they endure is not forever. All right? That God has his eye on all of these things, and time is boundaried and counted, and it will not last forever. And I've put on your notes other references in Revelation that refer to this similar time frame, and we've talked about it from Daniel already. But then the author uses Zechariah's olive trees, which we find in Zechariah 4:3. And there it was God's fruitful work, and the olive trees were God's witnesses to his work in ancient Israel. All right? And so these two witnesses are being compared to both the olive trees and the lampstands from visions in Zechariah, where the role of Israel's work as witness in the world is taken seriously. So the connection, and the reason the author can use this Zechariah material is because Zechariah understood Israel to be witness in the world, and the author is now taking that message and those images and saying, this is how we understand ourselves in the world. So on the second page of your handout, let's talk a little bit about the identity of these two witnesses. All right? The first blank, and I'm sorry if I've given you a little bit of writing to fill in here, the first blank is simply the phrase to shut up the sky. All right? That's the work of the first witness. And we can imagine who that might be. Can you think of any biblical figures that were used to sort of keep rain from coming or to shut up the sky? Elijah, right. So in my view, I think the author is using what Elijah did and now talking about the work of Christian witness with that image. The second description is to strike the earth with plagues, right? And who do you think of when you think of striking the earth with plagues? Right. So the question we have to ask is, I don't think there's any readers who wouldn't have understood this to be Moses and Elijah. So we have to ask the question, does the author think literally Moses and Elijah are coming back, or is he using them to talk about, and using the work that they did to talk about what it means to represent God in the world? All right? I want you to notice the role of the number 2 in the biblical concept of witness generally. So from the Old Testament references to covenant in places like Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 19, the strength of 2 witnesses, or the testimony of 2 witnesses, was considered to establish God's word, or to establish a firm perspective on something that was being given witness to. So the number 2 is important there. The number 2 is important as God exercises judgment on Sodom in Genesis 19. So you have 2 angelic messengers there. And the work now of what they do to shut up the sky or to strike the earth with plagues is really important for us to think about. What does it mean, and how should we interpret that in terms of the work of Christian mission, especially in light of Revelation 5, where it was a slaughtered lamb who gave meaning to all of the chaotic and broken activity in the world. So let's get to the point in your notes where I say, what's the interpretive point? These two witnesses, representative of the faithful community, embody both. And if you want to jot down underneath the first one, because I filled in the blanks for you, Elijah, right? What is Elijah famous for in terms of his work of shutting up the sky? It is a prophetic critique of power run amok in ancient Israel, right? So Elijah's running battle with Ahab and Jezebel and with the prophets of Baal. This is about power that's run amok, and it's been merged with idolatry in ancient Israel. So this, I think the first witness represents the prophetic critique of power. The second one, Moses, is a call for social justice and equity, all right? So if you think about what was the function of the plagues, right? And every kid who's read the Bible story knows the phrase, quote unquote, let my people go, right? That's the point. There's injustice, there's inequity. And so Moses comes to Pharaoh, and this notion of finally calling down plagues is in an effort to rescue and save the people of God. So it's inequity, it's power run amok. These are the kinds of things that these prophetic witnesses are calling to attention. So the question then is asked, if we understand ourselves to represent the Lamb, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to take that message into the world and to challenge broken power structures, to challenge injustice and idolatry, what happens when the people of God faithfully do that? Okay, there's change, and when change comes, that's sweet, isn't it? What also happens when you challenge power structures and injustice? Yeah, the people who have something to lose resist. There's hostility, often violence, and so there's also the bitter part of that. So my suggestion to you is that the author is not predicting that these two biblical figures come back to life and do a bunch of really bad stuff on earth. He's telling us a parable of what it's like to take God's word to the people of the world. And in the interest of time, I think we need to close. I need to dismiss and bless Ricardo and let him get on his way with the camera for downstairs. But I'm happy to continue the conversation here for anyone who